everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on risk management. In the spirit of reconciliation, PracticeHub acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people today. Thank you for joining us on our third webinar in our Foundations for Successful Practice Management series. Good practice governance skills are not just for practice owners and directors. As a part of your practice management team, you also need to understand your role in the governance of your organization so that together you can create a safer, more compliant and successful practice. That's why PracticeHub has created this webinar series presented in collaboration with market-leading practice management educators, UNE Partnerships. We have had yet another overwhelming response to this webinar, so clearly it's a topic of much interest and very topical for our present circumstances. We have a great panel with us this afternoon who'll be addressing some of the many questions which have come through via the registration. Thank you so much for those. On our panel, we have Gary Smith. Gary is known as the guru of practice management and is an academic director of UNEP health programs. He is an experienced health practice manager as well. Gary is a former national and New South Wales president of the AAPM and holds a number of board positions in the healthcare sector, both nationally and internationally. With more than 35 years real-world experience as a practice manager, Gary has broad experience and expertise in managing large multidisciplinary healthcare facilities and in healthcare reform. Gary understands how to navigate the challenges practice managers face daily and is uniquely placed to share his knowledge on running a successful, sustainable healthcare practice. Joining Gary today is Anna Maria Gibb. Anna Maria is a co-creator of My Practice Manual, now known as PracticeHub. She is passionate about helping healthcare organizations run more efficiently and minimize risk using better business management systems and processes. Anna Maria has a background in practice management and qualifications in business and adult education. She regularly presents on business systems and processes. I'll now hand over to Anna Maria.
Okay, thanks Persephone. So just a quick overview before we hand over to Gary. So Gary's going to talk through an introduction to risk management and then some more nitty-gritty details around the topic. And then the all-important role of compliance in risk management. And then finally, I'll do a demonstration of risk management and compliance and how that can be done very well in the PracticeHub platform. So Gary, I'd like to hand over to you to get us started, please.
Thanks very much, Anna Maria, and welcome to everyone on today's webinar on this Foundation of Successful Practice Management program around risk management for a post-pandemic world. And of course, it's challenging for us all in this latest post-pandemic world at present. But on a daily basis, we all manage risk, whether it's driving a car, especially if it's your partner, purchasing new equipment, introducing new procedures, or determining work priorities. Risk management is an integral part of you doing business. Now, as a manager, you have to create solutions to these unpredictable problems. What is the definition of risk? And everyone has a different definition of risk. But my definition is that risk is exposure to the possibility of economic, financial loss or gains, physical damage, injury or delay as a consequence, that's known as an outcome, or an event. In other words, the concept of risk is concerned about uncertainty of outcomes. I just want to go back and comment in relation to my first comment around what is risk. It is also around the economic and financial. Our presentation today will be talking around not only clinical risk, but also around business risk. I suppose this is my mantra. I would like you to adopt this mantra when you are thinking about risk. The challenge that you and I have got as practice managers, we like to be perfect. We like everything right, everything boxed up, and we want a solution to it. Well, I'm sorry to say that is not going to happen when we're talking about risk. Risk is inherent in everything which we do. We will never eliminate risk. You need to understand that we can only minimize it. Risk management is around giving you comfort. You cannot cover all bases when it comes to managing risk. That's why we actually have insurances. That's why we have policy and procedures to assist us in minimizing this risk. And today, thanks to Anna Maria and PracticeHub, she's going to provide you some policies and procedures and processes in your particular, what you may need to take to minimize risk, not eliminate it, attempt to minimize it. One of the risks we have to look at are business risks, and there are many different risks in a healthcare practice, and these can be grouped into types of risks such as I have said in the previous slide, clinical or business risks. Some examples of business risks include employment risks, and include risks such as appropriate recruitment and induction processes, things like work health and safety and injuries at work, staff morale, and risks associated with employment law. And we've touched on some of those risks in a previous presentation. There are property risks such as fire, theft, broken windows, and of course in Queensland in relation to flood risks as well. Another risk in business risk is technology, including systems, IT systems that go down at the most inappropriate times. And I think as a manager, this happens to us quite often, and not being able to access patient information or billing systems. Anna Maria, have you any comments in relation to or examples around technology risks?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I guess one of the things I found when I was doing a bit of research here was around notifiable data breaches, which of course is very topical in healthcare practices because we're dealing with so much personal and sensitive information. And according to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, health service providers report the most notifiable data breaches, and they have the highest number of data breaches due to human error and cyber incidents. And they're the second highest for malicious or criminal attacks. And these are areas where a good risk assessment and mitigation strategy could reduce the risk significantly and prevent those associated risks such as reputational damage and financial risks. And I'm sure we've all seen those stories in the media about, ransomware attacks and things like that. So I think that's a really important business risk organisations need to consider.
Just expanding on that, Anna Maria, we are required, this is talking about compliance, which you and I will talk about later on. Part of this particular comment that you made is we are required by LAW law to actually have a data breach plan in place. So it'll be interesting to see the number of practices who do not meet that requirement. So I think what we'll do, Anna Maria, is that we'll provide a link later on to a standard template of a data breach plan, which we are required to comply with. The other part of this one here, Anna Maria, is also about gaining access to patients' information, which I just spoke about. Do you realise the Medical Practitioners Act actually says they should not diagnose, treat or prescribe a patient if they don't have up-to-date information about that particular patient. Now, the challenge on this, a lot of doctors say, oh, but I know my patient, I know what they're on, I know them very well, I'll just write a manual script out if the computer's down. But really, if we work in a group practice, that doctor, that patient is a patient of the practice, not necessarily about that specific doctor. That doctor who they're seeing now may or may not be aware of a previous consultation they had with another doctor in the practice 2 or 3 days before. So the Medical Practitioner Act, Anna Maria, is really important when we're talking about technology and gaining access to relevant information. And of course, other business risks, the work health and safety risks, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on when we get to compliance. I think the big one here is business risk is reputational risk. Now, reputational risk to the practice or the doctors within our practice, including if the practice is found out to be defrauding Medicare as an example, or with incorrect billing or not managing duty of care. So reputational risk is really important as a business risk we need to think about. Security includes confidentiality and privacy, as well as security of drugs and money within the practice. And another business risk is financial risk. And we touched on this in a previous webinar, Anna Maria. It includes non-compliance with ATO or business regulatory requirements, as well as financial risks of the actual financial performance of that particular practice at that point in time. And that's business risk. Let's look at clinical risks now. Clinical risks, on the other hand, include risks such as breaches of confidentiality, or that could be a business risk as well, delays in diagnosis and treatment. And this is an important one in relation to up-to-date information under Australian privacy principle requirements here, Anna Maria, that we have to ensure that is up-to-date and current. So checking of data information, even demographics, the front desk of age, date of birth, address, these are critical points that flow through to being able to manage diagnosis and treatment in a timely and effective manner. Other clinical risks may be delays in referrals, and this is a challenge for us now as a result of COVID, and delays in referrals, or we may have prescribing errors, incorrect medications given, adverse drug events, failure to act on information that's already been provided to us. How often do doctors go back and look at those previous letters that have come in from specialists and make notes in the patient's file of what the specialist said? It may be, I've changed medication now to ABC. Does the doctor go back in and change the current medication list now to ABC? So failure to act on information is an important one, as a good risk. Clinicians working beyond their scope. Clinicians may be doctors, it could be nurses, it could be Aboriginal health workers, Aboriginal practitioners, MPAs. What are the scope? That's a clinical risk. And of course, infection controls issues as well. Many of these risks are addressed in various obligations and guidelines, all of which are aimed at improving patient safety and quality of care. Now, we'll talk more about how we get to these respective sections later on in the presentation. If we look at proactive managing risks, we need to think about turning survival management techniques into business opportunities. Proactively managing risk in a systematic approach gives you the chance to stop managing the business in a reactive manner and feel like we are responding to the issues to proactively plan for, and I think address risks before problems occur. This allows you and me to identify and exploit business opportunities and is a much more enjoyable way to manage a practice, as you are not always putting out bushfires. I want you to think proactively about identifying and managing risks rather than being reactive to these. And we'll talk a little bit more about later on about the college requirements around being proactive in risk management accordingly. Let's look at intrinsic risk factors accordingly. What's an intrinsic risk factor? Well, these are factors which are outside of the control of our business, which you may not have any control over. For example, a change in government generally indicates significant change in the health environment. Some projects will have the funding discontinued, for instance, whereas other areas will suddenly be funded depending on where the government's priority is at that point in time. Changes within Medicare or the practice incentive programs will potentially impact the practice's finances. Societal change, such as patients arriving, having diagnosed themselves via Dr. Google, and I know Anna Maria is going to talk a bit more about this in a moment. Beforehand, these impact on the business and create risks, which you won't necessarily be bad for the practice, but it's uncertainty and the needs to be considered, needs to be managed. The changing requirements of COVID vaccinations could have a clinical and business and reputational risks associated. And these frequently change advice. It was weekly, it's daily, and it can be hourly now. And we actually think about these external intrinsic risks. So what are these externals, these risks? These are opportunities and threats. These are the political, the economic, the social, cultural, and the technologies. These are the ones outside of our control. These are external influences making changes which we have to actually react to. So if you've not done a SWOT analysis or a pest analysis of your practice environment before, it is worth completing one just to see where the potential threats are. A SWOT analysis, as I said, looks internally. Well, the pest helps you analyse the bigger picture and strategic context within the area which you operate. Now, I'm going to hand across to Anna Maria to launch a poll.
So the question of this poll is, what socio-cultural or technological risks does your practice face? And Gary's mentioned, and I'm sure everyone's favourite, patients self-diagnosing with Dr. Google, how managing unfavourable reviews. I see comments around that quite a lot. I know it's even more frustrating when you discover the review isn't actually for your practice. That's just feels doubly challenging. Safe electronic communication with patients as their expectations change too. And safe electronic communication with other healthcare providers and your patient expectations.
I know you're going to talk this bit about later on as a policy, is this whole social media framework. Because there's this thing called expectations and obligations. You know, expectations in the social media by our patients to actually manage these. If they are our obligations in duty of care or whatever it may be, we have to put into place some framework of how we manage that. But social media, I think, is one of the biggest challenges for us. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Well, social media, and that's an ever-changing environment too. So I think this is one of those areas when you talk about doing a sort of, a pest analysis there, it's really an area you need to be doing regularly. That's not just a once a year or once in a blue moon thing, because it changes so quickly indeed. And look, I was only speaking earlier this week with someone, we were talking about the requirement in the standards for GPs, which frankly I think is really useful for any kind of practice type, is that you need to have an email policy, and that includes even if you don't allow patients to email you, you don't have that facility, you need to state that clearly as well, so that you're setting that expectation and managing that risk that your patients are expecting you to respond to their emails and receive their emails, but maybe that's not something you do.
It's not only in relation to emails, it's also about social media like websites and Facebook and LinkedIn profiles as well.
Let's have a look at some results.
Yeah.
One stood out well above the others, so let me share that with everyone. So you can see that safe electronic communication with patients was well out in front at 79%. So having strategies, and probably just what we were talking about there in terms of how do you electronic communication, because there is that expectation, it's convenient, but how do you do that safely and mindful of the privacy requirements as well?
Anna Maria, in relation to that one there, Avant has an excellent policy designed in conjunction with the RACGP in relation to this particular component of how do you send emails, or interacting with patients in relation to emails. As an accreditor, practices are still saying, "Oh, I can't use email because I'm not allowed to have a public network." Well, you can now, subject to managing risk, and that's what your policy does, or the policy. So that would answer that particular particular component really, really well. So thanks very much for that. It's about managing risk. The next section we're going to talk about now. How can risk management be integrated into our healthcare practices? And this risk management process we're going to talk about now must apply to all systems in a practical way. You notice the word systems, and managing risk is all about systems, policies and procedures, and they are the key to the success in managing risk. So what is risk management? We spoke about what the definition of risk was before. What's now the definition, my definition of risk management? And it's about identifying, analysing everything that can have a major impact on your business and putting plans into place to manage or reduce those impacts. A total business approach to risk management facilitates the creation of a risk awareness environment and a total risk management culture. Effective risk management requires what I call accountability and the appropriate balance of risk and control. Risk management needs to start from top down, not from bottom up. There has to be a culture of risk within the organisation. Now, to be most effective, risk management should be a part, as I just said, of organisational culture. It should be integrated into the philosophy, to the practice business plans, and not viewed as implemented as an isolation. Risk management should be integrated into everything which we do. If we have an organisational chart, risk management should sit across every component of our business: finance, HR, social media, and the list just goes on. There is a big part for effective policy and procedures in managing risk. Now, I'm going to ask Anna Maria to show you what may be some of these policy and procedures that Avant have in regards to this. Now, while she's loading that, I've got one comment in relation to risk management. Every person has a responsibility under the work health and safety legislation to report and manage risks. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to compliance. Anna Maria, over to you.
Terrific, thanks, Gary. So those of you who already have PracticeHub, a lot of these policies will seem familiar to you, but I've just kind of grouped them together under one heading for today's webinar. And if you haven't been and had a look at them, then I recommend that you do that. And just as a reminder, some of the things that we've talked about, or that, I think of as risks from a business perspective, the use of mobile electronic devices whether it's taking laptops to aged care facilities, taking images of patients, something on the patient with your mobile phone. How is that handled? How are you managing the privacy and security? What happens if the laptop gets stolen? Do you have two-factor authentication on there? All of these things that once you start using these devices, which have a huge level of convenience, but what are you doing to maintain that security? Because you don't want to be the ones on the front of the newspaper as, doctor's surgery loses laptop with all these people's patient records easily accessible. So how are you going to manage that? We've talked about the social media policy, again, so topical. Things like, safety risks is what do you need to do in the event of a fire? So, what are the types of non-medical emergencies that you might encounter in the practice? So maybe there's a fire or a false fire alarm. Bomb threats is not uncommon. What happens if the electricity supply fails? If you have property damage, break-in, you're using hazardous substances in some instances. What happens if there's a leak or someone is injured with those chemicals? So again, thinking about what does your emergency plan look like, treating them? Do you have evacuation processes? As an organisation, you have a duty of care to your team. Do they all know where the evacuation point is in the event of an incident, a fire or something like that? So these are things, it's important to think through. And then you can kind of see the other things that you do. You remind people there's no smoking at the practice. You keep your passageways and exits clear and those sorts of things. Other policies, everyone's favourite, ethical dilemmas as well. So really worthwhile thinking because, again, these can present risks to your organisation if they're not handled properly. Your recall system in terms of clinical risks. We've talked about the privacy and notifiable data breach. Gary mentioned about people working within their scope of practice and their qualifications. Very topical, particularly if you've got perishables such as vaccines. But, what do you do in the event of cold chain failure? There's a financial risk. There's potentially a clinical risk or a safety risk as well. From work health and safety, manual handling, protecting the staff and patients from infection, managing those difficult patients is a health and wellbeing issue. Violence in the workplace, how do you manage that? And things like having open disclosure, and how do you manage incidents? So I'll go through more of these too when I do the demonstration. We'll do a little bit of a case study and how you pull all these together. But Gary, I might hand over back to you.
There are certain standards and guidelines that we as practice managers need to consider. And here's two risk management guidelines and the college standards for the 5th edition accordingly. The one that the third one, of course, is work health and safety. So if we look at work health and safety component, and I'll talk a bit more about the college standards later on, and we're going to go through the ISO standard in a moment. Of course, there's work health and safety national requirements as well. So do you know about who owes a duty or who are the duty holders within your practice under the respective work health and safety legislation? Do you know about PCBUs, the roles of PCBUs and the roles of officers? Event have an excellent checklist. Though you've seen a peek preview already, Anna Marie's going to show you that link to work health and safety, which answers all your questions, and an excellent checklist as well. So quickly take them through that. Thanks, Anna Marie.
Sure, but it's a really good overview, I think, of work health and safety in Australia. So as Gary mentioned, who owes a duty, who are the duty holders, the principles that apply, so things like you can't transfer them, and key issue there around risk management as well. So that's very important. And then we have this fantastic term of a PCBU, person conducting a business or undertaking. So it's important, I think, that you all familiarise yourself with these terms and what responsibilities each of them has and the duties as well. And this page on the advanced side is really useful. I think it's great. It's a nice plain English breakdown of all this information and applicable to healthcare settings as well. So it's very useful. But as Gary said, other things that are in there, there's the general checklist. So just, if you're looking for a starting point for a work health and safety risk assessment, working through this checklist will give you a sense of, what areas are covered, what areas there may be gaps as well. So we have that checklist, and then I believe there's another item further along. So there is quite a bit to this, but this is such a critical piece of legislation. Now in PracticeHub, we do have an incident report template, but we also have one here as well in this page. So you can see these incident report templates, very simple, a really good starting point, and then you can expand those according to your own situation and environment as well.
We're now going to talk about risk management culture, and a way to evaluate your culture is to consider it, as I said, from a risk management approach. Now, my question to you is, does risk management and analysis underpin everything that you do in your practice? And I'd say no. But of course, this does not mean the practice is risk adverse or what I call lacks innovation. It does mean that every decision is made considering maybe the potential consequences, including those that are not obvious, and weighing up if the decision is supported from a risk and compliance perspective. Now, how do you do this? Do you do this in a formal process, or do you do it as a practice manager sitting behind the desk saying, I'm going to introduce a COVID clinic? Do I go through that risk process? Do I get other people involved in it? It could be formal, it could be informal. Nothing is wrong when we're thinking about risk. But remember that many of the rules and obligations encourage practices to be innovative, improve patient safety and quality, and that's important. Adopt technology to support the business. There is much risk in staying the same, particularly in healthcare, as there is trying new things. And I think that's an important part. Staying the same has greater risks than not being innovative. So the organisational culture should encourage and support what I call a systematic approach to risk management. And you'll know when this has been achieved, as everyone in the practice will think and take responsibility for risk management. We've got a poll, I think.
In this one, we're asking you, how do you promote a risk management culture? So please feel free to select all that apply to your organisation. And the options include having a risk identification form, a risk register, which importantly is visible to the whole practice, and having a standing item relating to risk management in your practice meetings, and that's clinical and non-clinical meetings, and doing a regular whole of practice walkthrough to identify risks. And it's as simple as things like that. Regularly we'll walk through the entire practice. You might walk around outside the building. Are the lights working? Is the water running off? It's not pooling and providing a slip hazard. So just those sorts of things.
Culture is an interesting word, Anna Maria. What is culture? Another very simple definition. It's the way we do things around here.
Yep.
I think that's important. And I think as leaders, we have to be seen to be having a culture. It's like the other day I was walking through the waiting room and there was a piece of paper on the floor. And I bent down and picked it up. And the patient came and saw me afterwards and said, who are you? And I said, I'm the practice manager here. And they said, I feel comfortable coming here because there's a culture here that you actually do what you say you do, picking up a piece of paper, because what you walk past is actually the standard which you set. And I think that's a really important thing when talking about culture. We have to lead. So what do the results look like, Anna Maria?
Okay, so well out in front is doing the regular walkthrough of the practice. So that's fantastic to identify risks. So 68% of our respondents do that. And also very pleasingly, 58% have a standing item on the meeting agenda to discuss risk. And nearly half have risk identification forms and a risk register. A risk register, I think, is so valuable because it's so useful for looking at trends as well.
I'm going to talk a little bit more later on in compliance, Anna Maria, around that.
Yeah, but yeah, so I think that's really good. I think, as you can see, even the simple thing is important of doing that whole practice walk around.
The walkthrough is critical.
It is.
Thanks very much. We're going to talk a bit about culture. This is about risk management discussions. Now, managers of successful organisations all recognise the importance of planning and control, and a big part of this is reporting on performance. As Anna Maria says, identifying trends is quite critical in managing incidents, and planning processes allow this to happen. Planning also means deciding in advance on what businesses need to do to undertake to achieve its goals in risk management. We addressed a couple of these points in a previous webinar around staff productivity, and we need to start to think about that fee earners should be allowed to maximise their time to provide the financial services which they are trained for and generate the related fees. Your role and my role in practice management is to highlight key issues and, where relevant, suggest appropriate corrective actions, and good reporting does this. Now, relying on a broad mix of evidence or proof will help you to come to the most clearly and what we call reasoned decisions and recommended actions. Involving your staff also helps others to feel a sense of ownership, and when the time comes, to make alterations to the business plan itself or to the policies and procedures we adopt within the practice in regards to risk management strategies, the ones that Anna Maria had identified. And this ownership and having an open door policy around the culture of risks allows us to go back and review our policies and procedures on a regular basis, because as Anna Maria and I spoke about previously, the external influences do that for us. And I'm going to give you an example in a moment of a letter I received from the Office of the Information Commissioner only yesterday. So information and analysis are essential ingredients for a well-managed practice. However, it is the corrective action, the doing bit, and the procedures that we adopt in the practice is what the key is. Anyone can read figures, anyone can read information, but it's how we analyse the trends and the reasons for them that makes risk management manageable for us. Next slide is about the umbrella of risks. And you may have seen this before, you may not have, but it is sometimes the case that practices are very good at managing clinical risks, as I've said previously, but particularly in smaller practices. Now, however, it is essential that risk management processes also include a range of other areas of risks, as I identified here in the umbrella of risks. Some detail of the aspects of the umbrella of risks. Think about customer quality, part as an umbrella of risk, which includes keeping patients waiting or not treating them with respect. Think about the legal risks, about privacy, about confidentiality, and about insurances. Think about information systems like interruptions to internet security, firewalls. Think about strategic and political risks, which we've spoke about before, and these are risks that we don't have control over. The last one I'll quickly highlight is about project risks. And every one of us today as managers, our day is all about projects, project driven. Everything you think about what you do in your practice is about project. Consider your practice putting a new computer system in. Consider your practice setting up a COVID clinic. So is your practice business ready to implement these new projects successfully? So what structure, what framework, what governance systems do you have in place? How will you measure the outcomes? How do you report the outcomes of have they been successful or not? Now, we're going to talk now about the 7-step process for risk management. And there are, as I said, complementary to a sound risk management approach is a robust system of administrative control. Notice the word system. This risk management process is described in ISO standard 31000 2018 risk management guidelines, in which there are 7 steps in providing a structured framework for each of you which needs to modify and develop to suit your practice. Now, this structure also demonstrates the process the practice needs to manage risk, and I'm going to touch on each of these 7 steps. So the first step is to establish the context of the risk management. This is the role of the practice management team, or perhaps the principals, depending upon your organisational structure of your practice. This is where you work out the practice's appetite for risk, the strategic context and the external environment, and the internal influences, policies and procedures and culture. Remember I said it's also about external environment. For example, will the practice accept losing $5,000 or $50,000 on a process? So what's the minimum number of practitioners the practice must have before the business is impacted? What about the front desk staff? Does the practice need to work out on context for risk management specific to the practice? Establish the context of risk management. Step number 2 is something we do quite well, is we identify the risk. This step is to identify the risk, we call the event, and the risk situation, which I call the where, the when, the how, and the why it can actually happen. When we're identifying the risks, there are specific to an activity. These are known as inherent risks. Risks that arise from a business itself, these are what I call process risks. An example of a process risk would be inadequate record keeping related to tax withheld from staff pays. So in your practice, you're going to ask the question, who's responsible for identifying risks? I think the practice manager is the person responsible for risk management systems, which includes identifying the risks, pulling them all together. Therefore, it is important to understand risk management thoroughly as a practice manager. The third step is analysing the risk. It's okay to identify, but then we have to analyse it. The determining of a risk level, or the level of a risk. It needs to be rated in terms of likelihood of the risk occurring, the likelihood of the occurrence, and in general, in the likelihood rating, we normally give a numerical or a numerical value. The next is step 3, analysing the risk. And I don't know whether we do this very well. Once we identify the risk, how do we analyse the risk? What are the mitigating strategies? So part of analysing the risk is consequence rating. Then consequence is of what would happen if the risk did occur. Generally, the consequence level is given a letter rating. So when we're considering consequences, if the risk occurs, consider the financial and non-financial impacts on the business as a result of the consequence rating. In the consequence rating, in analysing the risk, the next thing we need to look at is the risk rating matrix. And here is a standard risk rating matrix. And now, all pretty colours. If you're me, colourblind, I can't tell the difference between the red and the green. All I know, red's in the top right-hand corner and the green's the bottom left-hand corner. My staff tell me they know I'm colourblind by the clothes that I wear sometimes to work each day. They just don't match. So that's how I found out I was colourblind. But this slide actually shows you a standard risk rating matrix. It visually provides you a guide on what the likelihood and consequence of a risk may look like, unless you are, as I said, green and red colourblind like me. So I'm going to launch a poll here, Anna Maria.
So the question, this one's short and sharp. So our practice uses a risk rating matrix to assess risks, and it's a simple yes or no response. I really like this, Gary, because I feel like, you can identify a lot of risks, and then the next most important thing is around how do you prioritize? And this is what it allows you to do, that you're not spending your time on low risk items at the expense of high risk ones. So
you want to give an example?
Yeah, so the one I always like is about people getting paper cuts. So, you're working in the office and you pick up the paper, you get your paper cut, but really thinking about this, do we abandon the use of paper to prevent all paper cuts? Well, probably not. And that's because the likelihood is possible and maybe even unlikely, considering how much paper we use, and the consequence is insignificant. So in general, you've got a tiny paper cut, it hurts for a few seconds. But this is where we can basically say, the risk is so low is that we probably won't treat it other than to maybe keep the Band-Aids handy and a bit of, disinfectant or something. So that's an example. I like to think, we can't do away with paper, so we tolerate that low risk.
Right. How do we go with the answer to the poll?
It is virtually 50-50. I think, you've mentioned two things, Gary, around systems and culture. And I think having a risk rating matrix visible to everybody starts to highlight the fact that you have that culture that we look for risks, so we can manage them before they turn into actual events. And it promotes that open transparency and no blame culture of just, if you see it, say something.
The important thing about resources, Anna Maria, when we're thinking about resources and we're looking at this particular risk matrix, when we go through a series of risks, it could be things like any risk associated with our COVID clinic we set up, anaphylactic reactions, et cetera, you follow? Where we need to put our resources as a practice, and the great thing about doing this risk matrix, we just plug and play any sort of scenario which we have in our practice, like the paper cut. But where we put our resources and time and energy are really into the extreme likelihood and the high consequence in the red area. That's where we need to put our resources. Do I worry about the paper because it's low, but maybe I don't need to worry about that? But in relation to poor infection control and the outcomes of that, I'm going to put my efforts into high, or extreme. So visually, this is a really good document to think about or spreadsheet accordingly. So thanks very much for that, and thanks very much for your poll questions. Step number 4 is evaluating each risk. This requires you to evaluate the risks that you have identified, as we saw in the previous slide. There are a few different things to think about here. You need to have a pre-established criteria to guide you in this step. And we just showed you just a moment ago what's that predetermined criteria. It's the risk matrix. It's important when we think about prioritising what we call residual risks. Now, when there are risks that remain as risks, despite the controls you put into place, they need to be prioritised. And remember that risks can be accepted without further action, but they may need to be reviewed. And this is the important bit when we're looking at the evaluation of the risk. We start to put together a review process as well. Step number 5 is about treating the risk. And I think this is important for us. This is about risk mitigation strategies. Treating the risk. And this particular graphic here provides an indication of how each of the risks can be treated: extreme, high, moderate, and low. Remember that the controls are probably already in place within your practice at this particular stage, but the example of treating the risk. Now we'll go to step 6 and 7 here. And I think in the next slide, I actually think this is the overall summary of the risk management process. Step 6 is to monitor and review the tasks, the risks, and step 7 is to communicate and consult. As you will see from this particular slide here, there is that whole process of communication, recording, reporting, complete monitoring and review from there. Now, the next slide is around compliance. Compliance is the outcome of the practice meeting all its obligations it has. In other words, meeting all the regulatory requirements that are placed upon it. Last time I looked in New South Wales, a New South Wales practice manager had to apply to 132 bits of legislation, both state and national, accordingly. Now, for an example of introduction to compliance, there's the daily compliance which we have, but there's also these compliances which come left field. And yesterday I received a letter from the Office of the Information Commissioner of Privacy requesting me to provide them a copy of our policy on Rule 42, brackets 1 of the My Health Record Rule of 2016 on access and security policy. Our practice has been chosen because of our HPIO and access to My Health Records. Anyone else got one of those letters yet? All I'm saying is that in the marketplace now, but these, have you got a policy based around this? We should have. I do have, thanks to Avant and thank you to the RACGP. They've got templates around this. But all I'm saying is that compliance may be left field like something like this, or it could be something which we have to do every day. So let's look at the next slide, a hierarchy of regulatory compliance. I think when we look at this hierarchy of regulatory compliance, at the bottom of this hierarchy is often supported by standards and codes. But policies and procedures form the basis by which underpins all the hierarchy of regulatory compliance on this. So we should comply, and the way we comply is around by the policies and procedures which Anna Maria has spoken about today and the provisions she's made in regards to PracticeHub. Let's look at other compliance obligations, the next slide. In addition to the previous slide, the practice needs to meet these other obligations, including the ones which we've got on particular slides. What are the risks to the organisation, owners and management team if we don't comply to these? Once again, I think a good compliance chart. Have we got a compliance chart? Meaning that what do I have to do on a weekly basis, daily basis, monthly basis, annual basis? Most boards that I sit on have annual compliance charts. And as a director, these come up to each meeting just to ensure that the organisation is meeting their compliances, which is no different to us in the practice. Do we have a compliance chart telling us what we need to do when? I think it'd be good if you don't have. Part of managing risk would be to have that compliance chart. Right, let's have a look at what we call this risk management framework. Anna Marie mentioned before, the part of compliance is the standards for RACGP 5th edition of general practice, criterion C3.1. And this is mandatory. Our practice has a business risk management system that identifies, monitors and mitigates the risk in our practice. As a surveyor, most practices do not meet this because they talk about, oh, I've got that, I've got a reporting form. Now, a reporting form for incidences is one part of a framework. So the things we've spoken about today in the 7-step process addresses accreditation C3.1A, C. Our practice has a business risk management system that identifies, monitors, and mitigates the risk to the practice. In the next slide, this is what I call my health organisations compliance framework. A little bit like the umbrella of risk, but this may be the areas that you need to consider. And as I said, Anna Maria covered off in some of these in relation to the previous presentation around policy and procedures. The next slide is a result of a question which came up in a previous presentation that I'd like to frame in around risk management. And this was around things on staffing ratios, around billing and appointment systems within your practice, and the importance of managing your appointment and billing system as risk management. So what are these things? Depending upon your appointment system and your philosophy of billing, determines this thing called staffing ratios. And staffing ratios are a risk which we have to manage. For instance, a privately billing full appointment system and practice will have a higher staff ratio than a fully bulk billing practice where they only have walk-in patients. And of course, it's also related to the size of your practice. But some of the last figures that I saw, Anna Maria, around this whole component of staffing ratios. Now, wages is around, of total income, is about 25%, and wages as a percentage of expenses is around 50%. And the average support staff is one FTE practitioner to about 1.34 FTE. And remember, these FTEs may be higher. They could be as high as 1.74, depending upon the complexity of your practice, Anna Maria. So I hope that answers your question. So what we might do now, Anna Maria, I'll just put on the screen now the takeaway messages for today before you finish off with your PracticeHub demonstration. Understand what is risk management and how it may impact your business. Understand the terms and consequences of likelihood of risk. Have a good understanding of how to identify risk, instigate and mitigating strategies and monitor process. And of course, the last one is understand the link between risk and compliance. And I'll leave you with one thought, as I said before, risk is inherent in everything which we do, and we'll never eliminate it. We'll just learn how to minimize it. And across to you, Anna Maria, to show them how you may further how they may minimize their risks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gary. This will be a very brisk walkthrough. When we were preparing for this webinar, Gary and I discovered that risk management is our favourite topic.
Who would have thought, Anna Maria?
I know, imagine that. I always think it boils down to a little bit about what's the worst that could happen. If you look at these situations, what's the worst that could happen? And then how do you prevent that happening? All right, so what I thought I would do, seeing as I've already showed you some of our policies and that, I thought what I would do is a very quick little case study around what happens. You know, many of you are doing vaccinations, more vaccinations, and so perhaps a risk that you could identify is the increased risk of needle stick injuries now that the practice is doing more vaccinations. So thinking about Gary's 7-step process or the ISO standards, the first one was about establishing the context of the risk. So what's our appetite for that? Well, I think we probably have a fairly low appetite for people getting needle stick injuries. And we need to think about, you know, we have policies and procedures around these things. So that's sort of creating that context. So the policy talks about, you know, we do training, we have awareness is heightened during use, after use, and just when disposing, etc. So, you know, thinking about step 2, what can happen when we're identifying the risk? We've got the volume of injections, more needles, the process for disposal, the working environment. And if I was analysing this risk, I would say in this situation, maybe it's a possible, thinking about our likelihood is possible, the consequence being moderate. And therefore, from the risk rating matrix, I'd be thinking this is medium risk. So as we're doing this, we might think about our existing controls. So I've added this to our organisational wide risk register. So we have some business risk, clinical risk, And down here we have our safety risk. So as I said, the consequence moderate, the likelihood possible, the risk rating medium. So thinking about how we're going to treat the risk, well, perhaps we're going to need some more sharps containers so that people don't have to travel as far across the practice to dispose of them. Maybe we have more of them. And another possibility to help treat that is a reminder about the signage is in our policy and procedure. The user of the sharp takes responsibility for its safe management and disposal at point of use. So maybe everywhere you're using your sharps or where you have your containers, you have that there. So you're setting that expectation that the person using it is the one responsible for the disposal, not someone else. And that's a timely reminder if this is something you're doing. So the other things we talked about was having a standing item in your meeting agendas, having incident reporting protocols. And the other thing that I think is, a lot of these things is about communication and transparency. So having made all of these arrangements, one of the things we could possibly do is send a message to the team. So let people know what we're doing. As the practice has increased number of vaccinations, etc., we're going to have these signage, you're going to see more sharps disposal containers. The health and safety of the team is critical. And you can push that message out very easily to your team so that they're aware of that. And it's a prompt to also refresh their memories around some of those other policies that relate to this as well. Now, that was, as I said, an extremely brisk run through. If you're interested in finding out more, obviously go to the PracticeHub website. Some next steps. If you're already a client, contact our support team to find out how we can better help you. If you're not, please visit our website and one of our lovely team can probably show you more than I just did as well. And you can book a demonstration or have a chat with someone and the contact details are there. Please keep a lookout for our upcoming webinars. We have a couple of really exciting topics coming up over the next 2 months, which Gary and I are really excited to be doing. And so stay tuned to find out those and please do register. And if you do have any questions, please contact us. Gary, just to finally wrap up, thank you so much for your time today. It's always so insightful. And I say, this is just such an interesting topic. And the risk you manage today is the incident you don't have to deal with tomorrow.
Thanks very much, Anna Maria.